Minnesota taxpayers are the #1 funders of the Al-Shabaab terrorist group in Somalia. It's really interesting. We can't let it escape us that the reason that they like stuff like that being on the news for a short time, because I don't know if you've noticed, for the past couple decades, there's a big push towards letting conservatives be extremely racist against Muslims and Arabs, because it helps bolster the narrative that we're supporting Israel in the Middle East to like fight back against these Arabs, ignoring the fact that the West is essentially just letting them into their countries and starting all those wars at the behest of Israelis. And so we can't forget that, right? But on the other hand, we still have to appreciate just how crazy that is and how retarded it is that liberals will let their cities and their societies get to that point, right? And so in 2018, the amount of Medicare funding in Minnesota that went towards autism-based Medicare claims was around $3 million. So if you asked your typical shitlib, well, what's a normal increase? Because, you know, more people are autistic every year and the population increases. And so in 2018, it's $3 million. What do you think it would be in 2025, right? It wouldn't be out of this world to suggest that it might be $5 million. It might even be $6 million. I don't know. It's some reasonable number. It probably wouldn't be $30 million. It wouldn't be 10 times as much, right? It turns out it's over 100 times as much, $399 million. From 2018, they were spending $3 million on these autism claims, Medicare in Minnesota, and in 2025, it's $399 million, which is getting pretty close to $500 million, just on one specific type of Medicare claim. And it's primarily going to Somalian immigrants. And so some investigative journalists took a deep dive into the funding, into the fraud, where the money was going. They found out that, yes, the vast majority of these claims are completely fraudulent. The Somalis are gaming the system. And a lot of the money is actually being sent to the Al-Shabaab terror group in Somalia. So we get to this point now that in 2025, the Minnesota taxpayers are the #1 largest funder of the Al-Shabaab terrorist group, which is pretty crazy. And why are these immigrants committing fraud in such high amounts? The leftists on my Facebook page always claim, on my Facebook profile, they're always out there claiming that, you know, it's been debunked. Immigrants don't commit fraud. They aren't taking the Gibbs because they're not even eligible for those things and all this crap. That's not true. When you look into it, it's billions of dollars being lost to fraud. Why do the immigrants commit fraud so much and at such an insanely high scale? Hundreds of millions of dollars, we're talking. That's primarily being sent to a terrorist group, in addition to, of course, just being used to fund their lifestyles. How did we get to this point? That's crazy. We need to admit that the immigrants from third world countries are much more likely to commit this kind of fraud. And, you know, Trump right now is, you know, coming to the rescue and taking away their protected status, so they're going to have to leave the country. But at the same time, he wants to issue 600 million H-1B visas to Indians, and we know how much they like to commit fraud and scams. Near the majority of internet scams are, you know, Indians or Nigerians. So people need to realize this. There is definitely a genetic and ethnic aspect to it. Even if you don't believe there's a genetic aspect to it, there's an ethnic aspect to it, which undeniably in the data there's an ethnic aspect to it, which pretty much is the same thing. So when you ask a shitlib about this and you give them data, right, they'll gloss over. They don't really want to give a response. And in fact, one of the journalists that was here recently, she was, you know, basically said like, oh, I need to look at the data. I've heard that so many times. You bring up some really specific data and they're just like, oh, I don't know if I could trust your studies. I'm going to have to look into that. They never do, of course. And it's really irresponsible. If you're living in one of these countries that are seeing all these problems caused by mass immigration, and you've been alive for a couple decades at least, and you are not intimately familiar with that data, you're failing your duty, your civic duty as a citizen of that country. You're letting people be hurt. You're not looking into the data. When I tell any shitlib some specific piece of data about the insane levels of harm that third world immigrants are doing to any Western country, they should have at least looked into the data. They should at least know what I'm talking about. They always say, oh, I don't even know if I can trust that data, or what's the correlation does not equal causation, and then they never look into it. That's a failure. You're a failure as a human being if you aren't intimately familiar with the incredible harm that's being done to your society. If you think that harm is okay, you at least need a pretty darn good excuse or reasoning behind why you think it's okay, why you think we should put up with that. But we don't even get that because they're so heavily brainwashed. There is a mental block that sets in. They just can't even think about it. I know because when I was like 16, I probably thought that way too. So in Sweden, for example, something like 84% of the aggravated rapes in Sweden, of the violent rapes, are committed by non-European men, essentially migrants from third world countries, from Africa and the Middle East. And that's pretty insane. They make up less than 10% of the population, but they commit 84% of the violent rapes. Obviously, if you look at the number of rapes in Sweden over the last decade, it just keeps going up and up and up and up and up. It's absolutely insane that any shitlib responds to you by saying, well, you know, I think I'll just have to look at the data. I'm not really familiar with those studies. Major problem in society, and they're barely even aware of it. And they're not going to look into the data when their eyes gloss over and they say that. They're just going to consider you a racist and go on about your day. They're failures as human beings, right? Essentially, they're traitorous and treasonous to their society they live in. They're like, Algerian man in Sweden is 122 times more likely to commit a violent aggravated rape than a Swedish man. 122 times. That's not 122%. That's 122 times, right? That's absolutely insane. Like if you're 2 times more likely to do something, that means you're 200% more likely to do something. 122 times is insane. An Afghan man is 69 times more likely to commit violent rape in Sweden than a Swedish man. Absolutely insane. You see this everywhere, anywhere you let millions of third world migrants into Western countries. You need to look at the data. I'm tired of giving this data to shitlibs and their faces gloss over, and I know they're thinking in their head, this guy's a horrible racist, I don't even need to listen to him, and they respond like clockwork, well, I don't know what studies you're reading, or, you know, I'm going to need to look into the data. You know, they don't have a response. The few that are actually aware of the data, they don't have good reasoning as to why it's okay, why we should put up with it, why we should still allow the immigration when obviously it's causing all these problems. You don't even need to believe that there's a genetic component to it, which there undeniably is. There absolutely undeniably is, and there's plenty of data that supports that. But again, you know, I'd have to look into that data. You don't even have to have research that. You at least have to see that there's a problem, admit there's a problem, and come up with a better solution than glossing over your eyes and saying, I need to look into the data. I've gotten that response so many times. If I had a dime, every time a shitlib said to me, oh, I'm going to have to look into that data, or I don't know if I believe those studies. When you bring up like obvious crime and fraud statistics, insane percentages. We just talked about hundreds of millions of dollars being essentially stolen from Minnesota taxpayers, primarily by Somali migrants, being sent to a terrorist organization in Somalia. So now Minnesota taxpayers are the primary funders of a terrorist group, of violent terrorist groups. Trump loves that on the news, right? The Jewish right loves that on the news because they essentially want to direct people's energy towards Muslims and away from Jews, right? So they essentially want conservatives to be racist towards a certain type of Arab, but not towards one specific type of Arab, right? They're like, okay, well, you can dislike all the Muslim Arabs, but this one particular subset of Arabs that we call the Jews, let's not talk about them. Let's not talk about how the policies that their politicians and think tanks promote in Washington, the policies that AIPAC essentially puts into place by funding all the Congress people in the United States, and not talking about how those policies promote everything that I was talking about before, right? 122 times more likely to commit aggravated rape in Sweden, right? Third world migrants. 69 times more likely to commit aggravated rape in Sweden. Third world migrants commit 84% of the aggravated rapes, despite being less than 10% of the population. Third world migrants went from $3 million in Medicare autism claims to $399 million in really just a few years. and sent a lot of the money to a terrorist organization, third world migrants. It's happening everywhere. Liberals are in denial. They gloss over. They're failing their duty as a citizen. They need to stop acting like that. The world is changing. They don't have the upper hand anymore. We do. That's why you're seeing all this ridiculous meltdowns by politicians in the media now, because they're starting to realize that we have the upper hand now. The right has the upper hand, and we need to stop accepting that kind of answer from people. They need to be good citizens and research the issues that are affecting their society. If you are a shitlib, you need to be intimately familiar with these statistics that I'm talking about, and you better have a darn good reason as to why you think we should accept that. Because if not, you're just going to get swept away by history.